The first time I saw Oliver, I was 18 and reckless with my heart. The first time he saw me, I was just another girl at another party, lost in the crowd. But the first time I realized I was in love with him, it was raining. I had been running through the streets of Beijing, drenched to the bone, chasing after him like a fool. He had left a gathering early, and I had followed without thinking, without an umbrella, without a single plan in my head except to be near him. When I finally caught up, he was standing under a street lamp, lighting a cigarette with the kind of practiced ease that made it look poetic. "Selena," he said, exhaling smoke. "What are you doing?" I smiled, shaking the rain from my hair. "Chasing after you." He chuckled, the sound sharp and amused. "Of course you are. For 4 years, that's all I did. Chase." I loved him loudly, foolishly, shamelessly. I wrote him letters I never sent, baked him cakes he never ate, waited for him in places he never showed up to. And everyone knew it. In our circle of privileged heirs, socialites, and trust fund rebels, my infatuation with Oliver was entertainment, a running joke that never got old. "She'll never give up," they'd whisper. "Watch, she'll always come back." And I did. Until the night I didn't. It started with a party. The air was thick with music, champagne fizzing in crystal glasses, laughter spilling over expensive rugs. It was someone's birthday, but I wasn't paying attention to whose. I was watching the door, waiting, as I always did, for Oliver to arrive. And when he did, I saw her. Her name was Lily, and she was everything I wasn't. Graceful, refined, effortlessly elegant in a way that didn't require her to try. She was holding Oliver's hand. And when he introduced her, my girlfriend, Lily, he looked at me. It was the first time in 4 years that I didn't react. No jealousy, no tantrum, no broken-hearted outburst. Just a quiet nod and a faint smile, as if I had finally learned my lesson. But inside me, something cracked. The night went on. The room filled with the scent of roses and expensive perfume. People danced, drank, played drinking games I had once enjoyed but now found exhausting. I stayed in my seat, watching from a distance, detached in a way I never had been before. Then came the cake. This was my game, my tradition. Every year, I started the chaos, smearing frosting on someone's face, laughing as they chased me down. Oliver would roll his eyes, but would always shield me when I ran behind him. Not this year. This year, when the first smear of frosting landed on someone's cheek, I stayed seated. And when my friends, tipsy and giggling, tried to pull me into the mess, I dodged and weaved, careful not to get too close to Oliver. I laughed when they smeared frosting on my face, but it was a hollow sound. And when I slipped away to clean up, I didn't expect to hear my name. Selena. I turned instinctively, my heart stuttering before I could stop it. Oliver was standing there, leaning casually against the doorframe, his eyes unreadable. "You changed your necklace," he said. I reached for my neck on reflex. I had worn the necklace he gave me for 4 years. That night, I had left it in my drawer. "Yeah," I said simply. "I did." He smiled, but there was something strange in it. "Why didn't you come to the last gathering?" I hesitated. The truth was, I had been with Bruno that night. Bruno, Oliver's closest friend. The only person in our circle who had never found my infatuation amusing. The only one who had ever looked at me with something close to pity. I thought of his hands, rough and warm, gripping my waist. Thought of the way he had murmured my name like it meant something. Thought of the way I had clawed at his back, furious with myself, with Oliver, with everything. I had something else to do, I said. Oliver nodded slowly, like he didn't quite believe me. "What do you think of Lily?" I forced a smile. "She's beautiful. And she suits you." For a second, he just stared at me. Then, softly, he said, "I think so too." And then, almost like it was an afterthought, he added, "Which is why I'm suddenly thinking about getting married." I felt the floor shift beneath me. He watched me, waiting, expecting something. A scene, maybe. A dramatic declaration. Another foolish attempt to win him back. Instead, I exhaled slowly, smiled, and said, "That's great. Don't forget to send me an invitation." For the first time ever, Oliver looked confused. "Sure," he said after a beat. "You'll be the first to get one." Then he turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the dimly lit hallway, the taste of something bitter lingering on my tongue. When I walked back into the party, I spotted Bruno standing near the bar, a cigarette between his fingers, watching me with amusement. "What?" I asked, rolling my eyes as I grabbed a napkin to wipe the last bits of frosting from my dress. He smirked. "I leave for 2 days, and you two are already reigniting the old flame?" I snorted. "Reignite what? It never even ignited in the first place." Bruno took a step closer, his voice quieter now. "Then what's this, Selena? The new act? Are you finally giving up, or just pretending?" I hesitated. "Does it matter?" He tilted his head, considering. Then he said, "It does if you're lying to yourself." I didn't respond. Instead, I reached for my drink, taking a slow sip. Bruno's eyes stayed on me, searching, reading too much into my silence. Then, softly, he said, "I got you a new dress. Want to try it on?" I raised an eyebrow. "Since when do you buy me dresses?" "Since the last time you ruined one," he said simply. "Come on. Upstairs." And for some reason, I followed. I followed Bruno up the stairs, my heart pounding, not with excitement, not with anticipation, but with something far more dangerous. A strange, unfamiliar awareness. He walked ahead of me, his broad shoulders blocking my view of anything else, and for the first time, I wondered why I had never looked at him properly before. Why I had never noticed the way he carried himself, the way his presence filled a room effortlessly. He pushed open the door to one of the private rooms in the villa, the one we always used when our friends wanted to crash for the night. It smelled of expensive cologne and faint traces of whiskey. A dim lamp cast a warm glow over the plush furniture, and on the bed lay a carefully folded dress. "Here," Bruno said, tossing it toward me casually. "Try it on." I caught the fabric, surprised by its softness. It was a beautiful, sleek black dress, simple yet elegant. My fingers brushed over it lightly, something in my chest tightening. "You didn't have to," I murmured. Bruno leaned against the wall, watching me. "I know." We stood in silence for a moment, and I was acutely aware of his eyes on me, heavy, assessing. It wasn't like before, when he used to watch me with amusement, like I was some kind of spectacle. No, this time, there was something different in the way he looked at me. Something I didn't understand. "Turn around," I said finally. Bruno smirked but obeyed, facing the wall with an exaggerated sigh. "Happy?" I rolled my eyes and quickly changed, slipping out of my frosting-stained dress and into the new one. The fabric hugged my figure perfectly, cool against my skin. I turned to the mirror, startled by my own reflection. "It suits you," Bruno said, his voice lower than usual. I turned to find him watching me through the reflection in the mirror. He had turned around at some point, and now, he was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. His gaze flickered over me, lingering on places it had never lingered before. Something in my stomach twisted. "Bruno, you should stop looking at him," he interrupted, his voice casual but firm. I blinked. "What?" "Oliver," he said simply, as if the name alone was enough of an explanation. "You should stop looking at him like he's the only one in the world." My heart stilled. "That's none of your business." Bruno let out a soft chuckle, pushing himself off the wall. He stepped closer, closing the distance between us in a way that felt deliberate. "You're right," he murmured. "It's not. But it should be." I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. Bruno, I don't forget it, he said, shaking his head. I shouldn't have said anything. He turned to leave, but before I could stop myself, I grabbed his wrist. Wait. Bruno stilled, his eyes flickering down to where my hand gripped his arm. I could feel the heat of his skin through his shirt, the way his pulse beat steadily beneath my fingertips. What was I doing? He looked at me, and in that moment, something shifted. The air between us grew heavier, charged with an energy I didn't know how to name. My chest tightened, and I realized, with startling clarity, that I was afraid. Not of Bruno, but of myself. Because for the first time in 4 years, my heart wasn't beating for Oliver. It was beating for someone else. The next few days were a blur. I avoided Oliver as much as possible, declining invitations, ignoring his texts. I needed space. Time to think. But Bruno? He was everywhere. At gatherings, at dinners, at late-night parties where I least expected him. And every time I saw him, he would look at me, not with amusement, not with indifference, but with something unreadable. It unsettled me. And then came the engagement party. I should have seen it coming. Oliver had been acting strange lately, showing up at places he knew I would be, asking me questions that felt too personal, too intrusive. And now, standing in the middle of a grand ballroom, champagne glass in hand, I realized why. Selena, Oliver's voice cut through the noise, drawing my attention. I turned, startled, as he stepped closer, an unreadable expression on his face. What is it? I asked warily. He hesitated. Then, slowly, he pulled out an envelope. I took it, glancing down at the embossed lettering. An invitation. I'm getting married, he said softly. For a moment, the world tilted. The sounds around me faded into a distant hum, and all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, pounding like a drum in my ears. I had imagined this moment before, countless times. Had braced myself for it. Had told myself over and over again that I was over him. That I had moved on. And yet, standing here, staring at his name beside Lily's in elegant script, I felt nothing. No heartbreak. No devastation. Just emptiness. I looked up at Oliver, forcing a smile. Congratulations, I said. His brow furrowed slightly, like he hadn't expected me to say that. You're really not going to say anything else? What else is there to say? I shrugged. You've made your choice. I'm happy for you. For the first time, Oliver looked uncertain. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but before he could, another voice interrupted. Selena. Bruno. I turned just as he reached us, his presence suddenly overwhelming. He glanced at the invitation in my hand, then at Oliver, his gaze sharp and unreadable. Everything okay here? He asked casually, but there was an edge to his voice. Oliver tensed. Yeah. We were just talking. Bruno's eyes flickered to me. You good? I hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Yeah. Something passed between us then, something silent, something sure. Bruno turned back to Oliver, his expression unreadable. Congrats, man. Hope it works out. Oliver didn't respond. He just watched as Bruno took my hand gently, but firmly, and led me away. Away from the past. Away from everything I thought I wanted. And for the first time in years, I let him. The drive back from the engagement party was silent, but not the kind of silence that felt comfortable. It was thick, heavy with unspoken words and emotions neither of us were willing to confront. Bruno's fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel, his gaze locked straight ahead. I, on the other hand, stared blankly out the window, replaying the evening in my mind. Oliver's words still lingered, but they had no power over me anymore. It wasn't his engagement announcement that had left me feeling unsteady, it was Bruno. The way he had taken my hand, the way he had looked at me as if daring me to understand something neither of us had put into words. You're quiet, Bruno finally said, breaking the silence. I turned my head slightly, catching his reflection in the window. A lot on my mind. He scoffed. Yeah? Oliver still getting to you? I rolled my eyes, crossing my arms. Not everything is about Oliver, you know. Bruno's grip on the wheel tightened slightly, though his expression remained neutral. Could have fooled me. I wanted to argue. Tell him he was wrong. But deep down, I wasn't sure if he was. Instead, I sighed. Bruno, what are we doing? His jaw tensed, his knuckles whitening as he turned the car onto a quieter road. What do you mean? This, I gestured between us. Whatever this is. It's different now. He didn't answer right away. The tension between us thickened, a slow, creeping thing neither of us could ignore. Finally, he exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. I don't know, Selena. You tell me. The way he said my name sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't teasing, wasn't mocking. It was something else. Something deeper. I swallowed. Maybe we should stop. Bruno's hand stilled. Stop what? Whatever this is turning into. We're walking a thin line. For the first time since we got in the car, he turned to look at me, his gaze dark, intense. And what if I don't want to stop? My breath hitched. Bruno. No, answer me, he demanded, voice lower now, rough. What if I don't want to stop, Selena? What if I'm tired of pretending I don't care? My pulse pounded in my ears. You don't what? He cut me off. Don't look at you differently now? Don't want you in ways I never thought I would? His voice softened slightly, but it was still laced with frustration. Because if that's what you think, you're lying to yourself. I opened my mouth to protest, but no words came out. Because deep down, I knew he was right. Something had changed between us. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. Look, I get it. You've spent years chasing after Oliver. But maybe it's time you realize that he was never going to look at you the way I do. My stomach twisted. Bruno, it's not that simple. Why not? His voice was softer now, almost pleading. Why can't it be that simple? Because if it was, it meant admitting that I had wasted years of my life on someone who never really cared. It meant accepting that the person who had been standing right beside me all this time was the one who truly saw me. And that terrified me. I tore my gaze away. I need time. Bruno didn't say anything right away. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. Okay. Take your time. But just know, I'm not going anywhere. Time, as it turned out, was not something I had much control over. Days passed, and I found myself seeing Bruno everywhere. At gatherings, at dinners, at unexpected moments when I thought I could escape the weight of his words. And each time, he looked at me the same way, as if waiting for me to catch up, to understand what he had already figured out. It was maddening. Then, one evening, everything changed. I was supposed to meet a few friends at a bar, but when I arrived, I found Bruno sitting alone at the counter. You drinking alone now? I teased, sliding onto the stool beside him. He glanced at me, lips quirking up. Waiting for you. My heart skipped a beat. Oh. Since when do we make plans? We don't, he said, taking a slow sip of his drink. But I had a feeling you'd show up. Something about the way he said it sent a rush of heat through me. The night blurred after that. Drinks were poured, laughter was shared, and somewhere in between, I realized that being around Bruno no longer felt like a battle. It felt easy. Natural. And maybe that was what scared me the most. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about Oliver. I was thinking about the man sitting beside me, his fingers lightly brushing against mine, his voice low and steady as he told me about some ridiculous thing that had happened at work. I was thinking about the way his eyes softened when he looked at me. The way his presence felt more like home than any place I had ever known. And when the night was winding down, when the alcohol had settled into our bones just enough to loosen our inhibitions, Bruno leaned in, his breath warm against my skin. "Come with me," he murmured. I should have said no. I should have walked away. But I didn't. I followed him out of the bar, into the night, into something I couldn't name. And for the first time in my life, I didn't look back. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. The streets were quieter now, the hum of traffic distant as I followed Bruno through the dimly lit alley behind the bar. My heart pounded in my chest, though whether it was from the alcohol or the weight of his presence beside me, I wasn't sure. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Bruno didn't answer right away. He glanced at me, his gaze sharp but unreadable. "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere quiet." It sounded dangerous. It sounded like exactly what I wanted. He led me to a car parked at the curb, a sleek black machine that matched the intensity in his eyes. I hesitated only briefly before getting in. The second the door closed behind me, the space shrank, filled with a tension so thick I could feel it pressing against my skin. Bruno started the car, but he didn't drive. Not right away. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set, his expression unreadable. "You sure you want this?" he asked, his voice low. The question should have made me pause. Should have made me rethink everything. But it didn't. I nodded, my throat dry. "Yes." Bruno exhaled sharply, as if he had been holding his breath, and then the car surged forward, slicing through the quiet streets like a shadow. I had no idea where we were going, and for once, I didn't care. We pulled up in front of a high-rise apartment building, one of those sleek, modern places with floor-to-ceiling windows and doormen who never ask questions. Bruno killed the engine and turned to me. "Last chance to change your mind." I met his gaze, my chest tightening. "I'm not changing my mind." Something flickered in his eyes, something dark, something that sent a shiver down my spine. Without another word, he opened the door and stepped out, waiting for me to follow. I did. The elevator ride up was silent, the tension thick enough to drown in. Bruno stood close, his body radiating heat, his fingers twitching at his sides like he was barely holding himself back. I wanted to reach for him. I wanted to close the distance between us. But I didn't. Not yet. When we reached his floor, he led me down the hallway to his apartment. He pushed open the door, stepping aside to let me in first. It was surprisingly neat. Minimalist, but not cold. A few personal touches, a jacket draped over the back of a chair, a half-empty glass of whiskey on the counter, made the space feel lived in, familiar. Bruno locked the door behind us, then leaned against it, watching me. "You nervous?" I swallowed. "No." "Liar." I laughed, though it sounded breathless. "Maybe a little." Bruno pushed off the door and crossed the room in 3 long strides. Before I could react, his hands were on my waist, his fingers pressing into my skin just enough to make me gasp. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his lips inches from mine. I didn't. Instead, I tipped my chin up, meeting his gaze head-on. "Don't stop." And then his mouth crashed against mine. Kissing Bruno was nothing like I had imagined. It wasn't soft or slow or hesitant. It was urgent, desperate, as if he had been holding back for far too long. His hands roamed my body, mapping every inch of me like he was trying to memorize it. I let him. Somewhere between kisses and tangled limbs, we made it to the bedroom. Clothes disappeared, tossed aside without care. His skin was warm against mine, his body solid, unyielding. And when he whispered my name, it wasn't a question. It was a promise. And I wanted to believe it. Hours later, I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling. My body ached in the best way possible, but my mind refused to rest. "You're thinking too much," Bruno muttered, his voice rough with sleep. I turned my head to look at him. "How do you know?" He smirked, his fingers tracing lazy circles on my hip. "Because I know you." The words sent a strange warmth through me, one I wasn't ready to name. "What happens now?" I asked softly. Bruno didn't answer right away. He propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. "Now?" He ran a hand through his hair, sighing. "Now, we see where this goes." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But deep down, I knew things weren't that simple. And I had no idea what we had just started. The morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains, casting golden streaks across the bedroom. I blinked against the light, disoriented for a moment before the events of the night before came rushing back. My body was sore, every nerve still tingling with the memory of Bruno's hands, his lips, his weight pressing down on me. Beside me, he lay sprawled across the sheets, one arm draped carelessly over his face, his chest rising and falling in the slow rhythm of sleep. He looked different like this, unguarded, almost peaceful. The sharp angles of his face softened in the light, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I allowed myself to simply look at him. Then reality came crashing back. What had we done? Panic curled in my stomach as I carefully slid out from under the covers, trying not to disturb him. My clothes were scattered across the floor, mingled with his, a silent testament to the reckless choices of the night before. I gathered them quickly, slipping back into the dress I had worn to the bar, suddenly desperate to put distance between myself and the bed that still smelled like him. I shouldn't have come here. I shouldn't have let this happen. I barely had one shoe on when Bruno stirred. His arm shifted, and his eyes cracked open, still heavy with sleep. "Where are you going?" he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. I froze. I should go. He frowned, pushing himself up onto his elbows. "Why?" "Because this was a mistake. Because I had spent years chasing another man. Because if I stayed any longer, I might not have the strength to leave at all." But I couldn't say any of that. Instead, I forced a smile. "I just need to clear my head." Bruno studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "All right. I won't stop you." He said it so simply, so easily, as if my leaving didn't matter. As if this was nothing more than a one-night stand. And maybe that's all it was supposed to be. Still, something inside me twisted painfully as I turned away. I made it to the door before his voice stopped me again. "Selena." I hesitated, fingers tightening on the doorknob. "You don't have to run." I closed my eyes, inhaling sharply. But I didn't turn around. And then I left. The cold morning air bit at my skin as I stepped outside. The city was just beginning to wake, the streets still quiet, save for the occasional passing car. I pulled my coat tighter around me, my mind racing with everything that had happened. What had I done? More importantly, what was I supposed to do now? I had spent so many years convinced that my heart belonged to Oliver, that no one else could ever make me feel the way he did. But last night had shattered every lie I had told myself. Bruno wasn't supposed to matter. He wasn't supposed to be the one who made my breath hitch, my pulse race. And yet, here I was, standing on an empty sidewalk, feeling more lost than I had in years. I needed to talk to someone. I needed answers. Without thinking, I pulled out my phone and dialed the one person who had always told me the truth, no matter how much it hurt. "Bruno?" "No. Not Bruno." "Ava," I whispered when she answered, my voice barely holding steady. "Can you meet me? I think I made a mistake." Ava arrived at the cafe 20 minutes later, her eyes sharp as she slid into the seat across from me. You look like hell, she said bluntly. I let out a dry laugh. Thanks. That's exactly what I needed to hear. She raised an eyebrow, waiting. I hesitated, then exhaled heavily. I slept with Bruno. Ava's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look as shocked as I had expected. Well, that's something. Something? Ava, this is a disaster. Is it? She stirred her coffee, watching me over the rim of her cup. Or are you just scared that it wasn't a mistake? I stiffened. Of course it was a mistake. She sighed. Selena, you spent years chasing Oliver, and he never saw you. But Bruno? He sees you. And that terrifies you, doesn't it? I swallowed hard. It's not that simple. It is, she said firmly. You just don't want to admit it. I looked away, my hands tightening around my cup. What did he say when you left? She asked. I hesitated. He told me I didn't have to run. Ava smiled knowingly. And yet, here you are, running anyway. I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. Because she was right. I was running. And I had no idea if I would ever be brave enough to stop. 3 days passed, and I didn't hear from Bruno. I told myself it was for the best. That it meant he had moved on, that he wasn't expecting anything from me. But the silence only made the ache in my chest worse. By the 4th day, I couldn't take it anymore. I found myself standing outside his apartment again, my heart hammering in my chest as I knocked on his door. It swung open a moment later, and there he was. Bruno. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. Selena. I swallowed hard. I didn't know what I was going to say. I had come here without a plan, without an excuse. I just needed to see him. His gaze flickered over me, and then, slowly, he stepped aside. Come in. And just like that, I crossed another line I could never take back. Part 6, Confessions and Consequences. Stepping into Bruno's apartment felt different this time. There was no haze of alcohol, no impulsive rush of emotions clouding my judgment. This time, I was fully aware of what I was doing, of the weight my presence carried. Bruno closed the door behind me, his movements slow, deliberate. He didn't ask me why I had come. He didn't have to. The unspoken tension between us was thick, filling the space like a storm waiting to break. I swallowed, my throat dry. Hi. He arched an eyebrow, leaning against the doorframe. Hi. Silence stretched between us, neither of us knowing how to bridge the growing gap. He was waiting for me to speak, to explain, but I wasn't sure where to start. I took a deep breath. I shouldn't have run. Bruno's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. But you did. I nodded, looking down at my hands. I know. He pushed off the doorframe, stepping closer. So, why are you here now? That was the question, wasn't it? Why was I here? What did I want from him? From us? Because I couldn't stop thinking about you, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Because I needed to see you. Bruno exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. Selena, you don't get to play with me like this. I'm not, aren't you? He cut me off, his voice low but steady. You spent years chasing Oliver, convincing yourself he was the only one who mattered. And now that he's gone, now that you finally realize he was never yours to begin with, you come to me. His words stung because they were true. But it wasn't that simple. Bruno, it's not like that. Then what is it like? He took another step forward, closing the distance between us. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're scared of what this means. Of what I mean to you. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. I don't know how to do this. Bruno's gaze softened, just a fraction. Do what? This. Us. I gestured between us, frustrated with myself. It was easy with Oliver. He never saw me. He never made me question anything. But you make me feel things I don't know how to handle. Bruno's lips pressed into a thin line. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe you were never meant to love someone who made it easy. Tears burned the back of my eyes. I'm trying. Are you? He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Because all I see is someone who's looking for an escape, not someone who's willing to stay. His words hit me harder than I expected. I had always been a runner. When things got too hard, when feelings became too real, I found reasons to leave. But now, standing here in front of Bruno, I realized something. I didn't want to run from him. Not anymore. I don't want to leave, I said, my voice steady. Bruno's eyes searched mine, trying to gauge the sincerity in my words. Then prove it. I stepped closer, placing a hand on his chest. How? His fingers brushed against my jaw, tilting my face up to his. Stay. It was a single word, but it held so much weight. And this time, I wasn't afraid to say yes. The following weeks felt like walking a tightrope, balancing between something fragile and something unbreakable. Bruno and I weren't perfect. Far from it. There were moments of hesitation, moments where doubt threatened to creep in. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't alone in my emotions. We spent our nights together, wrapped in whispered confessions and tangled sheets. Our days were filled with stolen glances and teasing smiles, a secret only we understood. But secrets never stay hidden for long. It was at another gathering, a friend's birthday this time, when Oliver finally noticed. I felt his eyes on me long before he spoke, his gaze heavy with something unreadable. You look happy, he said, tilting his glass toward me. Didn't think I'd see the day. I frowned, taking a sip of my drink. What's that supposed to mean? Oliver shrugged, but his expression was too controlled, too careful. Nothing. Just an observation. My stomach twisted. Oliver, you and Bruno, he interrupted, his voice flat. How long? I inhaled sharply. Oliver, just answer the question, Selena. It's none of your business. Oliver let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. That's where you're wrong. It is my business. How? I asked, my frustration bubbling over. You're the one who's engaged. You're the one who made it clear that I was never an option. Oliver's expression darkened. That's not the point. Then what is? He hesitated, looking away. I just didn't expect you to move on so fast. I laughed bitterly. Fast? Oliver, I waited for you for years. Oliver's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. And that silence told me everything I needed to know. He had never expected me to stop waiting. He had never expected me to find someone who saw me the way Bruno did. And for the first time, Oliver wasn't the one with the power. I was. I turned away, my decision clearer than ever. Bruno was across the room, talking to someone, his face relaxed, his eyes finding mine the moment I looked at him. He smiled. And without hesitation, I walked toward him. The moment my feet carried me across the room, toward Bruno, I felt a shift in the air. It wasn't just in my own heart, but in the way Oliver's gaze burned into my back, in the way the people around us seemed to sense something unspoken threading its way through the space. Bruno turned toward me, his expression flickering with something warm, something knowing. He had been waiting for this moment, hadn't he? Maybe longer than I had even realized. Hey, he said, his voice low, steady. I exhaled, barely aware of the tension in my shoulders until it released. Hey. His eyes searched mine. You okay? I nodded, then hesitated. Oliver knows. Bruno didn't react right away. He simply watched me, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. And? I swallowed hard, glancing over my shoulder where Oliver stood, still staring, his expression unreadable. And he's not happy about it. Bruno exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. He doesn't get to have an opinion on this. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But a part of me still felt the weight of the years I had spent chasing after Oliver, waiting for something that had never been mine to claim. I didn't owe him anything. And yet, it felt like a ghost from my past was lingering just behind me, refusing to let go. Bruno must have seen the conflict in my eyes, because he gently took my hand, his fingers warm, grounding. Selena, he murmured. You don't have to explain yourself to him. I let out a shaky breath. I know. But, no buts, he said firmly. Not about this. Not about us. The words settled deep in my chest. Us. The very idea of it was still foreign, still terrifying in a way I couldn't quite put into words. But I wanted it. God, I wanted it. The party continued around us, but I barely registered the voices, the laughter, the clinking of glasses. Oliver eventually approached. I had expected anger. Maybe resentment. But his expression was something else entirely, quiet, calculated. Can we talk? He asked, his voice neutral. Bruno tensed beside me, but I nodded. Yeah. Oliver led me out onto the balcony, away from prying ears. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of city lights and distant rain. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, Oliver sighed, running a hand through his hair. So. You and Bruno. I crossed my arms. Yeah. He studied me, his jaw tightening. Did this start before or after I got engaged? I blinked. Why does that matter? Oliver let out a humorless laugh. Because it does. No, Oliver. It doesn't. I shook my head, my frustration simmering. You made your choice. And I'm making mine. His lips pressed into a thin line. I never thought you'd move on this quickly. I frowned. That's not fair. Isn't it? His gaze was sharp now, searching. You spent years chasing after me, Selena. And now, suddenly, you're with Bruno? You expect me to believe this isn't some kind of rebound? Anger flared in my chest. You don't get to do that. You don't get to diminish him, just because you're not used to seeing me with someone else. Oliver exhaled through his nose, his shoulders tense. I just didn't think it would be him. I scoffed. Why? Because you think he's not good enough for me? Or because you always assumed I'd be waiting for you forever? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence spoke volumes. I stepped closer, my voice quieter now. You were never going to choose me, Oliver. And maybe it took me too long to realize that. But I did. And I won't apologize for it. Oliver swallowed hard, looking away. I just don't want you to get hurt. Then let me make my own mistakes, I said, my chest tightening. Or maybe this isn't a mistake at all. For the first time, Oliver looked genuinely uncertain. And for the first time, I didn't care. Bruno was waiting for me when I stepped back inside. He didn't ask what Oliver had said. He didn't need to. He simply looked at me, really looked at me, and something inside me settled. You ready to go? He asked, his voice gentle. I nodded. Yeah. His hand found mine again as we left the party together, stepping out into the cool night air. This time, I didn't look back. The drive was quiet, but not tense. There was a strange sense of peace settling between us, like we had both crossed an invisible threshold neither of us could retreat from now. Bruno pulled up outside my building and killed the engine. He turned to me, his fingers drumming lightly on the steering wheel. You okay? I exhaled, nodding. Yeah. I think I am. He studied me for a long moment, then reached over, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. Good. I hesitated then, before I could overthink it, I leaned in and pressed my lips to his. It wasn't rushed or frantic like before. It was slow, certain. A promise in itself. When I pulled back, Bruno was smiling. Finally. I laughed softly. Shut up. He smirked. Come inside. I bit my lip. Bruno, not like that, he said, rolling his eyes. I just don't feel like leaving yet. Something warm bloomed in my chest. Okay. He followed me up to my apartment, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. Bruno was in my kitchen, shirtless, making himself at home like he belonged there. And maybe he did. You're up, he said, smirking as he leaned against the counter. I was starting to think you'd sleep all day. I stretched, my heart swelling at the sight of him. Good morning. He slid a cup of coffee toward me. Morning. I took a sip, watching him over the rim of my cup. Are we doing this? He tilted his head. Doing what? This. Us. Bruno's gaze softened, and he reached for my hand across the counter. Yeah, Selena. We are. And just like that, everything that had once felt so uncertain finally made sense. I was home. The morning light spilled through the windows, painting streaks of gold across my apartment. I stretched under the warmth of the sun, blinking away the remnants of sleep. The scent of coffee drifted through the air, mixing with something deeper, something more familiar. Bruno. The sound of dishes clinking in the kitchen was soft but steady. I turned toward the open doorway, catching sight of him. He was shirtless, his back facing me as he moved with ease around my kitchen. The way his muscles flexed with each movement was almost hypnotic, but it was the comfort in his posture, the way he belonged here without question, that made my breath catch. I sat up slowly, hugging the sheet to my chest. You really know how to make yourself at home, huh? Bruno glanced over his shoulder, smirking. Figured someone had to make sure you start your day right. I rolled my eyes, but there was no real annoyance behind it. I didn't ask for a personal chef. He turned, holding up a steaming cup. No, but you got one anyway. Now drink. I took the cup, our fingers brushing. The electricity between us hadn't dulled overnight. If anything, it had only grown stronger, more certain. I sipped the coffee, the warmth spreading through me, and for a moment, I allowed myself to just enjoy this. To enjoy him. But reality had a way of creeping back in. So, what now? I asked, keeping my voice light, though the weight behind the question was anything but. Bruno leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. What do you mean? I swallowed. This. Us. Are we just seeing where this goes? Or are we, Selena, he interrupted, his voice firm. I don't do things halfway. If I'm in, I'm all in. My chest tightened. And you're saying you're in? Bruno's gaze locked onto mine. I'm saying I've been in for a long time. The confession landed like a stone in my stomach, heavy with meaning. I had spent so much time convincing myself that love had to be chased, that it had to be fought for. But here he was, telling me it had been here all along. That I didn't have to run, or beg, or prove my worth. I didn't know what to do with that. Bruno, my phone buzzed on the table, cutting me off. I sighed, reaching for it out of instinct. The moment I saw the name on the screen, my stomach twisted. Oliver. Bruno's jaw tensed. You gonna answer that? I hesitated. I don't know. He exhaled through his nose, pushing off the counter. Do what you need to do, Selena. Just don't forget what you already know. I watched as he left the kitchen, giving me space. The call continued to ring. I pressed accept. Oliver, I said, keeping my voice neutral. There was a pause, then, Selena. We need to talk. I leaned back in my chair. I think we've already said everything that needed to be said. Not everything. Can we meet? Just for a few minutes. I closed my eyes. Oliver, why? What good is this going to do? I just need to say something to you. In person. Please. Something in his voice gave me pause. It wasn't anger or bitterness this time. It was something else. Something close to regret. Fine, I said before I could overthink it. 1 hour. Bruno didn't say anything when I grabbed my coat and keys, but I could feel the weight of his gaze as I left. Oliver was waiting at the cafe, already seated by the window. He looked different. Less polished. There was a tiredness in his posture that I hadn't seen before. I sat across from him. All right. I'm here. Talk. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling. I messed up. I arched a brow. Which part? There were so many. A humorless chuckle left him. Fair. I guess. I never realized how much I relied on you until you stopped waiting for me. My fingers curled around my cup. Oliver, I know, he cut in, shaking his head. I needed you to hear me say it. I took you for granted. And I know it's too late, but I wanted you to know that I see it now. I see you. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. You only see me now because I'm not chasing you anymore. Oliver's jaw clenched. Maybe. But that doesn't mean it's not real. It's too late, Oliver. I sighed, my voice softer this time. I've moved on. And I think you should too. He held my gaze, searching for something. Maybe a sign that I wasn't sure. But there was nothing left to find. Eventually, he nodded. All right. I won't bother you again. I stood up, offering a small smile. Goodbye, Oliver. As I walked out of the cafe, I felt lighter than I had in years. Bruno was sitting on my couch when I got home, flipping through channels like he had always belonged there. He glanced up as I stepped inside. How'd it go? I walked over, standing in front of him. It's over. He set the remote down, watching me carefully. You sure? I nodded. Yeah. I'm sure. Bruno studied me for a moment, then reached out, pulling me onto his lap. Good. I laughed, wrapping my arms around his neck. You're not even going to pretend to be humble about this, are you? He smirked, pressing a kiss to my shoulder. Nope. I shook my head, resting my forehead against his. Bruno, he hushed me with a kiss, slow and deep. I already know. And just like that, the chase was over. Because love wasn't about running after someone who never turned around. It was about standing still, about letting the right person find you. And Bruno had found me. Finally, I let myself be caught.